The massive steel doors of Tribunal Chamber 7 hissed open with a sound that echoed through the sterile corridors of Station Omega. General Vexstar shuffled forward, his massive form barely fitting through the reinforced doorway. The neural restraints around his neck and limbs hummed with energy, keeping the 8-foot-tall, alien docile, but alert. War crimes investigator Yoon sat behind a curved metal desk, her dark eyes fixed on the creature before her. She had interviewed dozens of war criminals over her 15-year career, but none quite like this. Vexstar represented the highest-ranking Keth Empire officer ever captured alive. His chitinous exoskeleton bore deep scars from plasma burns, and 2 of his 6 eyes had been replaced with crude mechanical implants. Prisoner 2847, be seated, Yoon commanded in Korean, waiting for the universal translator to process her words. Vexstar S. Mandibles clicked in what passed for acknowledgement among his species. He lowered himself onto the specially reinforced chair with surprising grace for something so large. His claws, each the size of a human finger, drummed nervously against the metal table surface, creating an unsettling rhythm that filled the chamber. Assistant Pack, fresh out of the Galactic Justice Academy, tried to hide his nervousness as he activated the recording systems. This was his first major case. And interviewing the alien responsible for the deaths of 3 million humans felt overwhelming. The young man's hand shook slightly as he calibrated the translation matrix. Recording active investigator Yoon, Pack announced, his voice steadier than he felt. Yoon leaned back in her chair, studying the alien commander with the patience of a seasoned interrogator. She had spent months preparing for this moment, reviewing battlefield footage, survivor testimonies, and classified military reports. The Keth Empire's invasion of Earth had lasted 8 brutal months, leaving entire cities in ruins and forever. Changing humanity's place in the galaxy, state your full designation and role in the invasion of Earth, Yoon commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had prosecuted the galaxy's worst monsters. Vexstar's translator crackled to life, converting his alien speech into flat mechanical words. I am General Vexstar, First Talon of the Crimson Fleet, Supreme Commander of the 3rd Assault Wave of the Keth Expansion Protocol. His voice carried traces of what might have been pride, even in defeat. I commanded 12,000 vessels. In the final assault on the human homeworld, the numbers hung in the air like a death sentence. 12,000 ships, more firepower than most civilizations could muster in their entire history. Yet somehow, impossibly, they had failed. Pack's stylus moved rapidly across his tablet, recording every detail. Young assistant had studied the war extensively, but hearing the scope of the invasion from the enemy commander himself sent chills down his spine. Vexstar's claws scraped against the table surface, leaving shallow grooves in the reinforced metal. We expected total victory within 7 rotations of your homeworld. Our strategic analysts calculated human resistance would collapse after the demonstration bombardment. His mandibles clicked faster, a sign of agitation among his species. Instead, we learned why the galaxy whispers about the silent species in the dark corners of space stations. Yoon exchanged a glance with Pack. The silent species reference had appeared in multiple intelligence reports, but no one had been able to explain its significance until now. Tell us about your first contact with human civilization, Pack leaned forward, unable to contain his curiosity despite the formal setting. The alien's 6 eyes seemed to dim, as if some internal light had been extinguished. When he spoke again, his voice carried a tremor that the mechanical translator couldn't quite mask. We had been monitoring your species for 3 cycles before the invasion. Our long-range scouts intercepted thousands of transmissions from your homeworld. Vexstar paused, seeming to gather himself before continuing. We heard your music's strange emotional sounds that served no tactical purpose. We observed your entertainment broadcasts, filled with fictional conflicts and imaginary heroes. Most disturbing of all, we detected audio recordings of your young offspring producing high-pitched vocalizations. Children laughing, Yoon translated quietly. Yes, Vexstar confirmed, his mandibles clicking rapidly. Why? To our warcast, these transmissions painted a picture of a species obsessed with leisure and emotion rather than conquest and survival. Our military advisors classified humans as harvest-ready, a term we reserve for civilizations that lack both the will and capability to resist incorporation into the empire. The alien's scarred head tilted slightly, a gesture that seemed almost human in its expression of regret. Our psychological warfare specialists were particularly excited by the transmissions. They believed a species that celebrated the weakness of its young would crumble at the first sign of real violence. They prepared standard intimidation protocols, expecting mass surrenders after minimal casualties. Pack's tablet chimed softly. As it processed the alien's words, the young assistant looked up at Yoon, who nodded for him to continue. "What changed your assessment?" Pack asked. Vexstar's remaining organic eyes focused on something far beyond the tribunal chamber walls. "Everything changed the moment our bombardment began. Could not have been more catastrophically wrong about your species." The bridge of the Bone Cleaver stretched nearly 200 meters from bow to stern, its curved walls lined with tactical displays showing the blue jewel of Earth growing larger by the hour. General Vexstar stood at the central command platform, his 6 eyes tracking multiple data streams as his massive dreadnought led the third assault wave toward the human homeworld. 3 cycles of travel through the void had brought them to this moment. Around him, the bridge hummed with activity as hundreds of Keth officers prepared for what their tactical computers predicted would be the shortest conquest in Empire history. The air recyclers worked overtime to process the excitement pheromones released by his crew, creating a thick, sweet smell that reminded Vexstar of previous victories. "Fleet status report," Vexstar commanded, his mandibles clicking with satisfaction. Subcommander Kralth, his second-in-command, approached with measured steps. "All 12,000 vessels report combat readiness, General. Bombardment craft have locked onto primary targets. Troop transports are loaded and awaiting your signal." Through the massive viewport, Earth filled their vision like a blue and white marble against the starfield. Vexstar had conquered 46 worlds before this one, and each had followed the same predictable pattern. A show of overwhelming force, followed by desperate pleas for mercy, then swift capitulation. The human world would make 47. "Their orbital defenses?" Vexstar inquired, though he already knew the answer. "Minimal, sir. Primitive satellites and a few outdated weapon platforms. Nothing that poses a threat to our shielding systems." Kroth's voice carried the confidence of someone who had never known defeat. "Our scouts report their military consists primarily of surface-based forces with limited atmospheric craft." Vexstar nodded, watching as formation after formation of Keth battleships took positions around Earth's gravity well. The sight never failed to impress him enough firepower to crack a moon, all focused on one small blue world. "Begin the demonstration." "Bombardment," Vexstar ordered, his voice carrying across the bridge. "Target their population centers." "Standard protocol, enough destruction to showcase our capabilities, minimal enough to preserve the labor force. They'll surrender within hours." The weapons officer, a scarred veteran named Vexmar, began the targeting sequence. Plasma cannons. "Charging, General." "Primary targets, locked 3 major population centers, as per Conquest Protocol." Through the tactical displays, Vexstar watched the targeting solutions appear on Earth's surface. 3 cities, each containing millions of humans, now sat under the crosshairs of weapons capable of turning stone to glass. It was always the same once the civilian populations witnessed such power. Their governments invariably chose survival over resistance. "Fire," Vexstar commanded. The Bone Cleaver shuddered slightly as its primary plasma batteries discharged. Brilliant blue streams of superheated energy lanced through space, followed by similar volleys from a dozen other dreadnoughts. The combined barrage struck Earth's atmosphere, creating brief aurora displays before impacting their targets. Vexstar expected the usual response: panicked communications, desperate attempts to contact the invasion fleet, offers of unconditional surrender. Instead, something unprecedented happened. Every human communication frequency erupted simultaneously. "Sir," the communications officer called out, his voice tight with confusion. We're intercepting massive signal traffic from the planet's surface. Surrender broadcasts. Vexstar asked, though something cold was beginning to form in his stomach. No, sir. They're coordinating. The main display shifted to show communication patterns across Earth's surface. Instead of the chaos Vexstar expected, he saw organized networks of information flowing between the attacked cities and every other population center on the planet. Military frequencies, civilian networks, even primitive internet systems all carried the same types of messages. What are they saying? Vexstar demanded. The translator worked overtime to process the flood of human languages. Evacuation routes, resource allocation, defensive preparations. The communications officer paused, his mandibles clicking with disbelief. General, they're mobilizing their entire species. Subcommander Krauth moved to the tactical station, his confidence beginning to waver. Sir, we're detecting movement in every major population center. Military and civilian vehicles are converging on our projected landing zones. This wasn't in the Conquest Manual. Vexstar had seen species fight before brief. Desperate struggles that ended when their leaders realized the futility of resistance. But this was different. The humans weren't panicking or pleading. They were organizing. Show me, Vexstar ordered. The main screen filled with orbital surveillance footage of the planet below. In the 3 cities they had attacked, massive evacuation efforts were underway. But instead of fleeing randomly, the humans moved with purpose. Children, elderly, and wounded were being transported away from population centers, while every adult capable of fighting was moving in the opposite direction. Sir, the tactical officer's voice cracked with disbelief. They're rushing toward our landing zones. Vexstar watched in growing horror as streams of human vehicles, military transports, civilian cars, construction equipment, even agricultural machinery flowed toward the areas where his forces planned to establish beachheads. Most disturbing of all, he could see their primitive aircraft being modified in real time. Those atmospheric craft, Vexstar pointed at the screen. What are they doing to them? The sensor operator zoomed in on what appeared to be a civilian airport. Hundreds of humans swarmed over passenger aircraft, cargo planes, even small private vessels. They were welding metal plates to the hulls, mounting improvised weapon systems, strapping explosive devices to the landing gear. They're turning civilian aircraft into attack vessels, Krauth whispered. But that wasn't the worst part. As Vexstar watched, he realized something that sent ice through his veins. The humans weren't just converting a few aircraft, they were converting everything that could fly. Crop dusters became bombers, helicopters became assault craft. Even recreational flying vehicles were being weaponized by civilians who had probably never held a weapon in their lives. Sir, we're detecting massive troop movements, another officer reported. But it's not just their military. Civilian populations are forming defensive units. Factory workers are producing weapons. Construction crews are building fortifications. Vexstar stared at the tactical display in growing disbelief. Red dots representing armed humans were appearing faster than his computers could track them. This wasn't an army they were facing. It was an entire species going to war. How many? Asked quietly. Current estimates suggest they're mobilizing. Nearly 1 billion combatants, sir, and the number is growing. The bridge fell silent except for the hum of machinery and the soft clicking of mandibles as the full implications sank in. Vexstar had brought 12,000 ships to conquer. A world defended by over 1 billion beings who showed no sign of surrender. For the first time in his military career, General Vexstar began to understand why the galaxy called humans the silent species. The interrogation chamber's lighting flickered as Vexstar's massive form trembled in the neural restraints. His mandibles clicked so rapidly they created a sound like rainfall on metal, and Investigator Yoon recognized the signs of severe psychological trauma. She had seen it before in war criminals, but never from a creature designed for conquest. Have to understand? Vexstar's voice cracked through the translator. We've conquered 47 worlds across the galaxy. Every species follows the same pattern. Either submit immediately when they see our fleet, or they fight for a few rotations before their leaders surrender to save their people. Humans did neither. Pac looked up from his tablet, stylus poised. "What do you mean?" Vexstar's 6 eyes focused on different points in the room, as if he couldn't bear to look at his interrogators directly. "After our bombardment, we expected the standard response. But instead of begging for mercy, they did something we had never encountered in 300 cycles of expansion. They adapted." The alien's scarred head tilted back as he recalled the nightmare that followed the initial assault. Within hours of our attack, every human communication network became part of a single coordination system, not just their military. Frequencies, everything. Their entertainment broadcasts, their commercial networks, even their personal communication devices. Suddenly, every human on the planet could share information instantly. Yoon leaned forward, intrigued. "That's not unusual. Most species attempt to coordinate their defenses." "No, you don't understand." Vexstar's voice rose, causing the translator to emit a harsh, electronic squeal. "They didn't just coordinate their military, coordinated their entire civilization. Factory workers who had never held weapons began producing explosives using industrial chemicals. Agricultural specialists started creating biological weapons. From farming supplies, even their younglings became part of the war effort." Pac's stylus stopped moving. Children offspring as young as 10 cycles became message runners through tunnel networks that appeared overnight. They moved supplies, carried intelligence, and maintained communication lines through areas we thought we controlled. Vexstar's mandibles clicked slower now, each sound deliberate. "We had protocols for fighting armies, not for fighting an entire species where every individual was a potential combatant." The alien paused, his breathing apparatus working harder as stress hormones flooded his system. "Their innovation was beyond anything in our tactical databases. We established a primary staging area in what they called agricultural territory, thinking it would be safe from military strikes. Within 2 rotations, a human soldier named KO led a unit that destroyed our entire supply depot. Using military equipment," Yoon asked. "Agricultural equipment?" His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "They converted harvesting machines into mobile weapons platforms. Grain silos became artillery positions. Irrigation systems became deployment networks for chemical weapons. They turned an entire farming region into a death trap using nothing but the tools they used to grow food." Pac's tablet chimed as it processed the translation, but the young assistant barely heard it. The image of farmers becoming warriors using only their everyday tools was both terrifying and inspiring. "Another human called on accomplished something our strategists declared impossible," Vexstar continued. "He converted an entire city's worth of delivery vehicles into mobile weapon platforms. Trucks that carried food became carriers of explosives. Vehicles that transported goods became troop transports. In less than 5 rotations, he created a mobile army using nothing but civilian infrastructure." The alien's claws scraped against the table as he struggled with the memories. But the worst part wasn't their innovation. It was their psychology. Every species we've conquered follows predictable patterns. They fight hardest at the beginning, then gradually lose hope as casualties mount. Humans did the opposite. Yoon exchanged glances with Pac. "Explain." "They fought harder when wounded. When we destroyed one of their military units, the survivors didn't retreat or surrender. They became more dangerous. When we killed their comrades, they didn't despair. They drew strength from it." Vexstar's voice carried genuine bewilderment. "Our psychological warfare specialists had no protocols for dealing with a species that becomes more dangerous when injured." The room fell silent, except for the hum of recording equipment and the alien's labored breathing. Yoon had interviewed dozens of war criminals, but she had never heard genuine fear in their voices like this. "We established containment protocols around captured humans," Vexstar resumed. "Standard interrogation procedures to gather intelligence about their defensive capabilities. But even our prisoners were unlike anything we had encountered before." Pac looked up, his youthful face showing concern. "What happened?" "Captured one of their fighters during a raid on a human settlement, a female called Im. She had been coordinating civilian evacuations while simultaneously directing resistance activities. According to our intelligence, she was a medical professional who had never served in their military." Vexstar's mandibles clicked slowly, each sound measured and deliberate. Our interrogation specialists were confident they could extract useful information from a civilian. They had broken trained military personnel from dozens of species. But this human, he paused, his scarred features showing what might have been admiration mixed with terror. She didn't break. For 7 rotations, she endured procedures that had shattered the minds of seasoned warriors. And when she finally spoke, it wasn't to give us intelligence. It was to deliver a message. What message? Yoon asked quietly. Vextar's 6 eyes finally focused on his interrogators, and for the first time since the session began, he looked directly at them. She looked at our interrogation specialist, a creature bred for extracting information through fear, said with perfect calm. You picked the wrong species to threaten our children. The words hung in the air like a prophecy. Pak's stylus had stopped moving entirely, and Yoon felt a chill run down her spine despite the warm temperature of the chamber. That's when we began to understand, Vextar continued, his voice now barely audible. We weren't fighting a military force. We weren't even fighting a government. We were fighting every human parent who had ever held their offspring. Every human who had ever loved something enough to die for it. We had threatened their young, and they would never stop coming. For us, the neural restraints around Vextar's neck pulsed with a soft blue light as his stress levels spiked. In the interrogation chamber, the massive alien's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing Investigator Yoon and Assistant Pak to lean forward to catch his words. The translator struggled with the subtle emotional undertones in his speech, creating brief pauses that made the testimony even more haunting. The turning point came during the siege of what humans called soul. Vextar began, his 6 eyes losing focus as he recalled the memory. We had been fighting for 6 rotations, making minimal progress against their defenses. My ground commanders were frustrated. Every time we secured a sector, the humans would counterattack, using tactics we had never encountered. His claws scraped nervously against the metal table, leaving fresh grooves alongside the dozens of others he had carved during the interrogation. I ordered a full assault on their medical district, thinking it would break their morale. In our experience, species that lose their ability to treat wounded quickly lose the will to fight. Pak's stylus moved rapidly across his tablet, but his eyes never left the alien commander. The young assistant had studied the Soul offensive extensively during his training, but hearing it from the enemy's perspective was surreal. The breakthrough came when my shock troops overran a human medical facility, Vextar continued. It was a large structure, what they called a hospital, filled with their wounded. My soldiers expected to find military intelligence, weapons, caches, or, at minimum, strategic information about human defensive positions. The alien's mandibles clicked slowly, a rhythm that seemed to match his heartbeat. Instead, we discovered something that broke our understanding of warfare itself. They were treating our wounded alongside their own. Yoon exchanged a glance with Pak. The reports about human medical facilities had been among the most controversial aspects of the war crimes investigation. Many tribunal members had initially dismissed them as propaganda. Explain what you saw, Yoon commanded. Vextar's breathing apparatus worked harder as stress hormones flooded his system. When my troops breached the main surgical wing, they found 17 Keth warriors in various stages of medical treatment. It's not interrogation, not imprisonment, tactual medical care. A human doctor named Bay was performing surgery on one of my officers, a sub-commander who had been captured 3 rotations earlier. The alien paused, his 6 eyes focusing on different points in the room, as if he couldn't bear to look at his interrogators directly. My officer's abdomen had been torn open by plasma fire. According to our combat medics, his wounds were fatal. But this human doctor was working to save his life while her own city burned outside the hospital windows. Pak looked up from his tablet, his young face showing disbelief. The humans were performing surgery on enemy combatants during an active battle. It's not just surgery. Vextar's voice cracked through the translator. Full medical treatment. Pain management, infection, control, even psychological counseling for those suffering from combat trauma. They had created a separate wing of the hospital specifically for treating Keth wounded. The alien's scarred head tilted back as he recalled the scene. When my soldiers burst into the operating theater, weapons drawn, expecting to find prisoners. Being tortured for information, Dr. Bay didn't even stop working. She was elbow deep in my officer's chest cavity, trying to repair damaged organs that no human had ever seen before. Yoon leaned forward, intrigued, despite herself. What did she say? Looked up at my heavily armed troops and said with perfect calm, "Help me move him to safety, or get out of my way." "I'm trying to save his life." Vexstar's mandibles clicked. Rapidly, my soldiers were so shocked, they actually helped her transfer the patient to a secure area. The psychological impact of that moment rippled through Vexstar's forces like a virus. Keth warriors, bred from birth for conquest and trained to see all other species as inferior, found themselves facing an enemy that showed mercy to their wounded while simultaneously fighting with unparalleled ferocity to protect their own. My troops began asking questions that had no answers in our military doctrine, Vexstar continued. If humans were primitive and weak, why were they saving Keth's lives? If they were the enemy, why were they treating our wounded better than we treated our own? Assistant Pack made rapid notes as Vexstar described the confusion that followed. Keth, soldiers conditioned to believe in their species' superiority, began experiencing cognitive dissonance that their commanders couldn't address. The situation deteriorated further when my communications officer intercepted human emergency broadcasts. Vexstar's voice carried genuine bewilderment. A civilian named Lee was coordinating evacuation routes for Keth wounded through active combat zones. Not human wounded. The alien's claws scraped against the table more frantically. Lee was using his knowledge of the city's tunnel systems to guide medical teams to locations where injured Keth soldiers could be safely extracted and transported to human medical facilities. They were risking their lives to save our people, while we were killing theirs. Yoon leaned back in her chair, processing the implications. What effect did this have on your force's morale? Vexstar's 6 eyes finally focused on her. She saw something she had never expected to see in an alien conqueror shame. It shattered completely. My army split into 2 factions. Half began questioning the entire invasion, wondering if we were fighting the wrong enemy. The other half became terrified of facing opponents who could be both merciful and merciless. The alien's voice gained strength as he continued. You have to understand, Keth warriors are trained from hatching to fight enemies who want to destroy us. You know how to face hatred, anger, fear, but how do you fight someone who is trying to kill you on the battlefield while simultaneously saving your wounded comrades in their hospitals? Pack's stylus stopped moving as he absorbed the alien's words. Your soldiers couldn't process the contradiction? They couldn't process humans, Vexstar replied simply. My troops began experiencing what your psychologists would call mental breakdowns. Some refused to fire on human medical personnel. Others became paranoid, convinced that human mercy was actually a form of psychological warfare designed to weaken our resolve. The interrogation chamber fell silent except for the hum of recording equipment and the alien's labored breathing. Vexstar's massive form seemed to shrink in the restraints as he recalled the disintegration of his once proud army. The final blow came when my own wounded officers, the ones who had been treated in human medical facilities, began returning to our lines, he continued. They told stories of human doctors working 18-hour shifts to save Keth's lives, of human nurses learning our anatomy from captured medical texts so they could provide better care, of human civilians donating their own blood for transfusions when our biochemistry proved compatible. Yoon made a note on her tablet. How did your command structure respond? Command structure? Vexstar's mandibles clicked in what might have it been bitter laughter. There was no command structure left. Half my officers were questioning orders. The other half were requesting transfers off-world. Some units simply laid down their weapons and refused to fight an enemy that showed more concern for Keth lives than their own commanders did. The alien's voice dropped to barely above a whisper again. That's when we learned the most terrifying truth about humans. They weren't fighting to conquer us or to prove their superiority. They were fighting to protect their families, and they would show mercy to anyone who wasn't threatening their children.
Ow.
But if you did threaten their young, his voice trailed off. They would never stop hunting you, Yoon finished quietly. Vexstar's 6 eyes fixed on her with genuine respect. Now you begin to understand why the galaxy fears the silent species. The interrogation room's lights dimmed automatically as the session entered its final phase, casting long shadows across the metal walls. Vexter's massive form seemed to deflate. In the neural restraints, his 6 eyes dulled with exhaustion and something that looked remarkably like shame. The alien's breathing apparatus worked slower now, each cycle deliberate and measured as he prepared to deliver the most devastating part of his testimony. Investigator Yoon sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the metal table. In 15 years of prosecuting war criminals, she had learned to recognize the moment when even the most hardened monsters broke down and revealed their deepest fears. That moment had arrived. The final revelation came 8 rotations into our failed occupation. X began, his voice so quiet that the translator had to amplify the signal. The forces were scattered, demoralized, and suffering casualties we couldn't replace. Half my fleet was damaged beyond repair, and the other half was requesting immediate withdrawal. System Pack looked up from his tablet, stylus poised. Despite the young man's professional training, he couldn't hide his fascination with hearing the enemy's perspective on humanity's greatest military victory. That's when your Admiral Han contacted me directly through military channels, Vex continued. I expected the usual demands for surrender, threats of total annihilation, or at minimum, negotiations for our withdrawal. Instead, he did something that broke my understanding of warfare completely. The alien's mandibles clicked slowly, each sound echoing in the silent chamber. He offered me safe passage for civilian evacuation ships. Not military vessels, civilian transports carrying Keth families who had been living in human space before. The war began. Yoon leaned forward, intrigued. Admiral Han was offering to protect enemy civilians. He was offering to escort them safely out of the combat zone, Vex confirmed. Han explained that human forces had identified 17 refugee camps where Keth families were trapped between our military positions and human defensive lines. He wanted to arrange safe passage for over 50,000 non-combatants. Pack Stylus stopped moving as he processed the implications. During an active war, Admiral Han was prioritizing enemy civilian safety. Vex's scarred head nodded slowly. That wasn't the devastating part. During our communication, Admiral Han transmitted something that shattered my entire understanding of the conflict. He showed me the truth about human military capability. The room's temperature seemed to drop as Vex paused, gathering himself. For what was clearly the most difficult part of his testimony, everything we had been fighting for, 8 rotations, your orbital defense platforms, your coordinated resistance networks, your tactical communication systems, it was all civilian. Infrastructure repurposed for war. Your actual military had been held in reserve. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Pack's tablet slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering onto the metal table. What do you mean? Yoon asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Vex's eyes focused on different points around the room, as if he couldn't bear to look at his interrogators directly. Admiral Han showed me deployment schedules for weapon systems we had never encountered. Defensive installations that could have ended our invasion in hours rather than months. Military units that had been monitoring our every move since we entered the system. The alien's claws scraped against the table, leaving fresh grooves in the reinforced metal. When I asked why they hadn't deployed these assets, why they had allowed the war to continue for 8 rotations when they could have ended it immediately, Admiral Han said something that still haunts my dreams. Yoon waited, sensing that this was the crucial moment of the entire testimony. He looked at me through the communication screen and said with perfect calm, "We wanted to see if you could be reasoned with first." Beck's voice cracked through the translator. They had been testing us. 8 rotations of war, millions of casualties on both sides, entire cities destroyed, and they had been holding back to see if we were capable of reason. The interrogation chamber fell completely silent, except for the hum of recording equipment and the alien's labored breathing. Pack retrieved his tablet with shaking hands, while Yoon struggled to process the full implications of what she was hearing. Admiral Han then transmitted tactical displays showing human military positions, Vex continued. Underground bunkers filled with weapons that could have vaporized our fleet from the planet's surface. Orbital platforms we had dismissed as communications. Satellites that were actually disguised weapon systems. Mobile defense units that had been shadowing our ground forces for months, close enough to strike but holding their fire. The alien's mandibles clicked rapidly, betraying his emotional state. He showed me submarine fleets capable of launching planet-to-space missiles from beneath Earth's oceans. Atmospheric fighters that could have overwhelmed our air support in minutes. Ground-based artillery that could have turned our landing zones into glass craters. Yoon leaned back in her chair, trying to absorb the magnitude of what Vex was describing. The humans had been fighting with only a fraction of their actual military capability. Less than a fraction, Vex confirmed, according to Admiral Hans. Data: they had deployed approximately 8% of their available military assets. The rest had been kept in reserve, waiting to see if we would demonstrate any capacity for mercy or negotiation. Pak's young face showed a mixture of pride and horror. What happened when you realized this? Vex's eyes finally focused on his interrogators, and for the first time during the session, they saw something that looked like genuine respect in the alien's expression. I understood why the galaxy calls humans the quiet ones, he said. Simply, they rarely speak in galactic councils not because they lack power, but because they don't need to make threats. They are the threat. Every species that has ever considered aggression against human space should remember the fate of the Keith Empire. The alien leaned forward in his restraints, his massive form straining against the neural bonds. You asked me to testify about? Fighting humans. I have done so. No, we never fought humanity's true strength. We fought their restraint. We fought their mercy. We fought their hope that we might be better than we were. Even that was enough to destroy us completely. His voice dropped too barely above a whisper as he delivered his final words. War with humanity isn't about whether you can defeat them in battle. It's about whether they'll allow you to survive learning why you should never have tried. Vex. Scarred features showed something that might have been gratitude as he concluded his testimony. Admiral Han could have ended our species. Instead, he gave us safe passage home and the opportunity to warn others. He showed mercy to those who had shown none. That is why humans terrify every military strategist in the galaxy, not because of their weapons, but because of their wisdom in choosing when not to use them. The recording devices captured the alien's final statement. I pray to whatever gods you believe in that no other species is foolish enough to test human patience, because next time they might not be so merciful. The interrogation chamber fell. Silent as the testimony concluded, in the darkness beyond the viewport, stars wheeled slowly through space. Each one representing worlds that would soon receive. Vex warning about the species that preferred peace but excelled at war. The END